In the year 1730, Thomas Baker lived in a small village in Massachusetts. The village sat quietly between rolling hills and a lazy river that sparkled under the sun. Thomas was a farmer, like his father and grandfather before him. He wasn't rich or important, just a man who worked hard and loved God. Every morning before the sun peeked over the hills, Thomas knelt by his bed and prayed. He thanked God for the day, for his small wooden house, and for the crops that grew in his fields. Thomas's house was simple. It had one room with a fireplace, a table, a chair, and a bed. The walls were made of logs he'd cut himself. He didn't need much. His life was plain, and he liked it that way. Every Sunday, he walked 2 miles to the village church, a small building with a steeple that leaned slightly to the right. There, he sat on a hard wooden pew and listened to Pastor William Jones talk about God's love and the importance of living a good life. Thomas believed God watched over him. He felt it in the cool breeze that swept through his fields and in the way his corn grew tall each summer. He wasn't a man who asked for much. He prayed for enough rain, for his crops to grow, and for his neighbors to be kind. Most days his prayers were answered. The rain came when it was needed, his corn grew, and his neighbors were friendly enough. One morning, Thomas woke up early, as always. He lit a candle and read a few pages from his worn Bible. The pages were thin, and the words were printed in small, neat letters. He read slowly, not because he couldn't read well, but because he wanted to think about each word. Today, he read about Noah and the ark. Thomas wondered what it would be like to build something so big because God asked you to. He didn't think he could do it. He was just a farmer, not a builder of great things. After reading, Thomas ate a breakfast of bread and cheese. He drank water from a tin cup. Then he put on his hat, grabbed his hoe, and walked out to his fields. The air was cool, and the sky was pale pink. He liked this time of day best. It felt like God was close, watching over the world before it got busy. Thomas's field was small, but it was his. He grew corn and potatoes, and he had a few apple trees near the edge of his land. He worked all morning, pulling weeds and checking his crops. The sun climbed higher and sweat dripped from his forehead. He didn't mind. Work felt good. It made him feel like he was doing what God wanted, taking care of the land and living simply. Around noon, Thomas sat under an apple tree to rest. He ate an apple and drank more water. As he sat, he thought about his life. He was 30 years old and had no wife or children. Sometimes he wondered if he should marry. His neighbor, Sarah Miller, was kind and pretty. She went to church every Sunday, just like him. But Thomas was shy. He didn't know how to talk to her about anything other than the weather or crops. He prayed about it sometimes, asking God to show him what to do. So far, God hadn't answered that prayer, or maybe Thomas just wasn't listening hard enough. In the afternoon, Thomas went back to work. He fixed a fence that had been damaged by a storm. The wooden posts were old and one had split. He hammered in a new post, his hands steady and strong. He thought about how God gave him the strength to do this work. He wasn't a big man, but he could swing a hammer or carry a sack of potatoes without trouble. He thanked God for that. As the sun began to set, Thomas walked back to his house. The sky turned orange and the air grew cooler. He lit his fireplace and cooked a simple supper of potatoes and a small piece of salted pork. He ate slowly, looking out his window at the darkening fields. He felt peaceful. His life wasn't exciting, but it was good. He didn't need adventure or riches. He had his farm, his Bible, and his faith. After supper, Thomas sat by the fire and read his Bible again. This time, he read about Moses leading his people through the desert. Thomas thought about how hard it must have been to trust God in such a big, unknown place. His own life was small and predictable. He liked that. He didn't want to wander in a desert or build an ark. He just wanted to farm his land and go to church. Before bed, Thomas prayed again. He knelt by his bed, his knees pressing into the wooden floor. He thanked God for the day, for the food he ate, and for the strength in his hands. He asked God to watch over his crops and his neighbors. He hesitated, then added a quiet prayer for Sarah Miller. Maybe one day he'd find the courage to talk to her. Maybe God would show him how. Thomas climbed into bed and blew out his candle. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the fire. He closed his eyes and listened to the crickets outside. He felt safe knowing God was there, watching over him as he slept. Tomorrow would be another day of work, prayer, and quiet faith. That was enough for Thomas. The stars shone brightly outside and the village slept. Thomas's life went on, steady and calm, just the way he liked it. The sun rose slowly over the Massachusetts village, casting a soft golden light across Thomas Baker's fields. It was Sunday, and Thomas woke with a sense of calm. Sundays were special. They were for church, for resting, and for feeling close to God. He got out of bed, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. He knelt and prayed, as he did every morning, thanking God for the new day and asking for a heart full of faith. Thomas washed his face with water from a bucket. He put on his best clothes, a plain white shirt, brown trousers, and a coat that was slightly worn at the elbows. He didn't have much, but he made sure his Sunday clothes were clean. He combed his hair, put on his hat, and grabbed his Bible. The walk to church was 2 miles, but Thomas didn't mind. The path wound through fields and past a few other houses, where smoke curled from chimneys into the crisp morning air. As he walked, Thomas thought about the sermon he'd hear today. Pastor William Jones always had something to say about God's love or how to live a good life. Thomas wasn't one for fancy ideas. He liked the simple messages. Work hard, be kind, trust God. That was enough to guide him through his days. He passed Sarah Miller's house on the way. Her small garden was neat, with rows of carrots and beans. Thomas wondered if she'd be at church today. She usually was, sitting a few pews ahead of him with her sister Mary. The church came into view, its steeple tilting just a bit to the right. A few people were already outside, talking in quiet voices. Thomas nodded to James Carter, a blacksmith who lived on the other side of the village. James was a big man with a loud laugh, but he was kind. "Morning, Thomas," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good day for worship, isn't it?" "It is," Thomas replied, smiling. He wasn't much for talking, but he liked James. They walked into the church together. The room was plain, with white walls and rows of wooden pews. A small table at the front held a cross and a candle. Thomas took his usual seat near the back. He opened his Bible and read a few verses while others filed in. The air smelled of wood and wax. Sarah Miller walked in with Mary. They wore simple dresses, Sarah's blue and Mary's green. Thomas glanced at them, then looked back at his Bible. His heart beat a little faster, but he pushed the feeling away. He was here for God, not for daydreams. Still, he noticed how Sarah smiled at her sister as they sat down. It was a kind smile, the kind that made you feel warm. Pastor William stepped to the front of the church. He was an older man with grey hair and a voice that carried without being loud. He welcomed everyone and began the service with a prayer. Thomas bowed his head, listening to the pastor's words. They were simple, asking God to guide the village and keep everyone safe. Thomas felt the words settle into his heart, like seeds in good soil. The sermon was about the parable of the sower. Pastor William talked about how God's word was like a seed, and people's hearts were like different kinds of ground. Some hearts were hard, like rocky soil, and the seed couldn't grow. Others were soft, like good earth, and the seed took root. Thomas listened carefully. He wondered what kind of soil his heart was. He hoped it was the good kind. He tried to live right, to pray, to be honest. But sometimes he worried he wasn't doing enough. After the sermon, the congregation sang a hymn. The voices were soft and a little out of tune, but Thomas liked the sound. It felt real, like people coming together to praise God. He sang quietly, his voice blending with the others. When the hymn ended, Pastor William prayed again and the service was over. People stood and talked, their voices filling the small church. Thomas stayed in his pew for a moment, looking at his Bible. He didn't want to rush out. He liked the quiet feeling of the church after the service. James Carter came over and asked if Thomas was coming to the village supper later. Once a month, the church held a supper where everyone brought food to share. Thomas nodded. "I'll be there," he said. He'd bring some apples from his trees. As he stepped outside, Thomas saw Sarah Miller talking to a group of women. She laughed at something one of them said, and Thomas felt that same warmth in his chest. He wanted to say something to her, maybe just hello, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he started walking home. The path felt shorter on the way back, maybe because his mind was full of thoughts about the sermon and Sarah's smile. When Thomas got home, he ate a simple lunch of bread and apples. He sat at his table, looking out at his fields. The sermon stayed with him. He thought about the seeds and the soil. He wanted his heart to be good soil, to grow God's word like he grew his crops. He prayed a short prayer, asking God to help him be better, to be kinder, to be braver. The afternoon passed slowly. Thomas cleaned his house, sweeping the floor and stacking firewood. He thought about the village supper. Maybe tonight he'd find the courage to talk to Sarah, or maybe he'd just sit quietly, like always. Either way, he trusted God had a plan. He'd keep praying, keep working, keep living his simple life. The sun began to set, and Thomas got ready for the supper, feeling a quiet hope in his heart. The sun dipped low, painting the Massachusetts sky with streaks of orange and pink. Thomas Baker stepped out of his small log house, a basket of apples in his hand. Tonight was the village supper, held in the open field behind the church. Thomas felt a mix of calm and nerves. He liked being around his neighbors, sharing food and stories, but the thought of seeing Sarah Miller made his stomach flutter. He said a quick prayer for courage, then started the walk to the church. The evening air was cool and crickets chirped in the grass. Thomas's boots crunched on the dirt path. He passed fields of corn and a few houses with glowing windows. The village was quiet except for the faint hum of voices growing louder as he neared the church. The field behind it was already busy. Long wooden tables were set up, covered with cloths and plates of food. Lanterns hung from poles, casting a warm light over the gathering. Thomas set his basket of apples on a table next to a loaf of bread from James Carter's wife Elizabeth and a pot of beans from widow Hannah Green. He nodded to a few familiar faces, Samuel Brown, who owned the mill, and Martha Davis, who sold eggs in the village. Everyone was smiling, happy to be together after a long week of work. Thomas stood near the edge of the field, watching. He wasn't much for jumping into conversations, but he liked listening. Pastor William Jones stood up and raised his hands to quiet the crowd. He prayed, thanking God for the food, the harvest, and the community. His voice was steady, and Thomas bowed his head, feeling the words sink in. When the prayer ended, people clapped and started filling their plates. Thomas waited his turn, not wanting to push through the crowd. He took a small plate of beans, a slice of bread, and one of his own apples. He found a spot to sit on a wooden bench near a lantern. As he ate, Thomas watched the villagers. Children ran around, laughing and chasing each other. Men talked about crops and weather, while women shared recipes and news. Sarah Miller was across the field, helping her sister Mary serve slices of a pie they'd brought. Thomas noticed how Sarah's hands moved carefully, cutting the pie into even pieces. She smiled at everyone she served, and Thomas felt that familiar warmth in his chest. He wanted to go over, maybe say something about the pie, but his feet stayed planted. James Carter plopped down on the bench next to Thomas, holding a plate piled high with food. "Good apples you brought, Thomas," he said, taking a big bite of one. "Sweet this year." "Thanks," Thomas said, nodding. "The trees did well." James chewed and looked out at the crowd. "You ever think about settling down, Thomas? A man like you, steady and God-fearing, ought to have a wife." Thomas's face grew warm. He took a bite of bread to avoid answering right away. "I think about it," he said finally. "Just waiting for God to show me the way." James chuckled. "God's got a way of showing you when the time's right. Look at me and Elizabeth. I was too shy to talk to her for years. Then one day I just did. Now we've got 3 kids. Thomas nodded, thinking about Sarah. Maybe James was right. Maybe he just needed to take a step. He said a silent prayer, asking God for a bit of boldness. He finished his food and stood, brushing crumbs from his coat. The crowd was thinning as some folks started heading home. Sarah was still at the pie table, cleaning up with Mary. Thomas took a deep breath and walked over. His heart pounded, but he kept going. Sarah looked up as he approached, her blue dress catching the lantern light. "Evening, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. "Evening, Thomas," she replied, smiling. "Did you try the pie? Mary made it." "I didn't yet," Thomas said. "It looks good, though." Sarah cut a small slice and handed it to him on a tin plate. "Here, try it. It's apple, like your trees." Thomas took the plate, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. He felt his face heat up again. "Thanks," he said, taking a bite. The pie was sweet and warm, with a hint of cinnamon. "It's real good," he said, meaning it. "Glad you like it," Sarah said. She looked at him for a moment, then went back to cleaning. Thomas stood there, unsure what to say next. He wanted to keep talking, but words didn't come easy. Finally, he said, "Your garden's looking nice this year." Sarah glanced up, surprised. "Oh, thank you. I've been working hard on it. The beans are coming in well." Thomas nodded. "Beans are good. Mine are doing all right, too." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it felt like a start. He finished the pie and handed the plate back. "Thanks again, Sarah." "You're welcome," she said, her smile soft. Thomas tipped his hat and walked away, his heart a little lighter. He hadn't said much, but he'd said something. That was more than he'd done before. As he walked home, the stars were bright above. Thomas thought about the evening, the food, the laughter, the pie. He thought about Sarah and how her smile made him feel. He prayed as he walked, thanking God for the supper and for giving him the courage to talk, even just a little. He asked God to guide him, to show him if Sarah was part of his plan. The night was quiet and Thomas felt peaceful. His life was simple, but it was good. He trusted God to lead him, one small step at a time. The days grew shorter in the Massachusetts village, and the air carried a crisp edge that hinted at autumn. Thomas Baker woke each morning to a world painted in soft golds and reds. His fields were ready for harvest, the cornstalks tall and the potatoes heavy in the ground. Thomas felt a quiet pride in his work. He believed God had blessed his land, and he was grateful. Every morning, he knelt by his bed and prayed, thanking God for the season and asking for strength to bring in the crops. Thomas's days were long now. He started at dawn cutting corn with a sickle and digging potatoes with a spade. His hands were calloused, but he didn't mind. The work felt honest, like a way to honor God's gift of the land. He filled wooden crates with golden ears of corn and round, dirt-dusted potatoes. By noon, his back ached, but he kept going, stopping only to eat a piece of bread and drink water from his tin cup. One morning, as Thomas worked, he saw Samuel Brown, the miller, walking along the path by his field. Samuel was a stout man with a grey beard, known for his fair prices and steady faith. "Morning, Thomas," Samuel called, waving. "Your crops look fine this year." "Thanks, Samuel," Thomas replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "God's been good to me." "That he has," Samuel said, stopping to lean on the fence. "You bringing any corn to the mill soon?" "Planning to," Thomas said. "Maybe tomorrow once I get this field done." Samuel nodded. "I'll be ready for you. The mill's been busy, but I'll make time." He tipped his hat and walked on, leaving Thomas to his work. Thomas liked Samuel. He was a man who spoke plainly and went to church every Sunday, just like Thomas. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas thought about the harvest. It was hard work, but it brought the village together. Neighbors helped each other, sharing tools and hands. Last year, Thomas had helped James Carter with his wheat, and James had helped Thomas with his corn. This year, Thomas hoped to do the same. He prayed for good weather, no early frost, and enough strength to finish the work. Around midday, Thomas sat under one of his apple trees to rest. He ate an apple, its juice sweet and cool. He looked out at his fields, half-harvested, and felt a sense of peace. This was his life, simple, steady, tied to the land and to God. He didn't dream of big things, like moving to a city or owning more land. He just wanted to keep farming, to keep praying, to keep living quietly. In the afternoon, Thomas went back to work, filling more crates. His muscles were sore, but he kept a steady pace. As he worked, he thought about Sarah Miller. He talked to her at the village supper, just a few words, but it felt like a small victory. He wondered what she was doing today. Maybe she was harvesting her own garden or helping Mary with chores. He said a quiet prayer, asking God to watch over her and to give him courage if he saw her again. Near sunset, Thomas heard a horse's hooves on the path. It was Elizabeth Carter, James's wife, driving a cart. She stopped near the field and waved. "Thomas, I brought you some water," she called, holding up a jug. "James said you've been out here all day." Thomas walked over, grateful. "That's kind of you, Elizabeth," he said, taking the jug. He drank deeply, the water cold and refreshing. "Harvest going well?" Elizabeth asked, her hands resting on the cart's edge. "It is," Thomas said. "Corn's good, potatoes too, should have enough to last the winter." Elizabeth smiled. "You're a hard worker, Thomas. God blesses those who put in the effort." She paused, then added, "You should come by for supper soon. James talks about you all the time." Thomas nodded, a little shy. "I'd like that. Thank you." Elizabeth waved and drove off, the cart rattling down the path. Thomas watched her go, feeling warmed by her kindness. The village was full of good people, and he was glad to be part of it. As the sky turned purple, Thomas loaded his crates onto a small cart to take to the barn. The work was nearly done for the day, and his body was tired. He walked back to his house, the air cool against his skin. Inside, he lit a fire and cooked a simple meal of potatoes and a small piece of bread. He ate at his table, looking out at the darkening fields. The stars were starting to appear, faint pinpricks in the sky. After supper, Thomas sat by the fire with his Bible. He read about the harvest in the book of Ruth, how she worked in the fields and found favor with Boaz. Thomas liked the story. It was about simple people, like him, living their lives and trusting God. He thought about his own harvest, his own fields. He wasn't looking for favor, just enough to live on and share with others. Before bed, Thomas prayed. He knelt by his bed, his hands folded. He thanked God for the harvest, for the strength in his arms, and for neighbors like Elizabeth and Samuel. He asked God to keep the village safe through the winter. He hesitated, then prayed for Sarah again, asking God to guide his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he trusted God to show him the way. Thomas blew out his candle and lay down. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day lift. Tomorrow would bring more work, more prayers, more small steps in his quiet life. That was enough. The autumn air grew cooler in the Massachusetts village, and the leaves on Thomas Baker's apple trees turned a deep red. His harvest was nearly done, with crates of corn and potatoes stacked neatly in his barn. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he'd have enough to get through the winter. Each morning he thanked God for the bounty, kneeling by his bed with his hands clasped tightly. Today, he had a task ahead, taking his corn to Samuel Brown's mill to be ground into meal. Thomas woke early, the sky still grey. He lit a candle and read his Bible, flipping to the book of Psalms. The words were simple and comforting, talking about God's care for those who trusted him. Thomas read slowly, letting the verses sink in. He wasn't a man for big thoughts, but he felt God's presence in the quiet moments like this. After reading, he prayed, thanking God for the day and asking for safe travels to the mill. He ate a quick breakfast of bread and an apple, then loaded his cart with sacks of corn. The cart was old, its wheels creaking, but it was sturdy enough. Thomas hitched his horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, and started down the dirt path toward the village. The morning was chilly, and his breath puffed out in small clouds. The path wound past fields, now bare after the harvest, and a small pond that reflected the rising sun. The mill sat by the river, its big wooden wheel turning slowly as water rushed over it. Thomas could hear the steady grind of the millstones before he even saw the building. Samuel Brown was outside, sweeping the steps. He looked up and waved as Thomas approached. "Morning, Thomas," Samuel called. "Brought that corn, I see." "Morning, Samuel," Thomas replied, pulling the cart to a stop. "Got a few sacks ready for you." Samuel helped Thomas carry the sacks inside. The mill smelled of dust and grain, and the air was warm from the spinning stones. Thomas liked the mill. It was a place where hard work turned into something useful, like his farm. He and Samuel worked quietly, pouring corn into the hopper. The stones rumbled, grinding the kernels into fine meal. Thomas watched, fascinated by the simple machine. He thought about how God made the world to work in such practical ways. Water turned the wheel, stones ground the corn, and people were fed. As they worked, Samuel talked about the village. "Heard Widow Hannah's been sick," he said. "Pastor William's been visiting her, praying for her health." Thomas nodded, concerned. "I'll pray for her too," he said. Hannah was kind, always bringing extra beans to the village supper. He hoped God would heal her soon. "Folks are saying the winter might be hard this year," Samuel went on. "Cold's coming early. You ready for it?" "I think so," Thomas said. "Got my crops stored, firewood piled. Should be enough." He didn't like to boast, but he felt prepared. God had provided, and he trusted there'd be enough to share if neighbors needed help. When the corn was ground, Samuel filled Thomas's sacks with meal. "Good batch," Samuel said, patting a sack. "This'll make fine bread." "Thanks for the work," Thomas said, handing Samuel a few coins. It wasn't much, but it was fair. Samuel waved it off, saying, "Pay me with some of that bread when you bake it." Thomas smiled. "I'll do that." He loaded the sacks onto his cart and started back home. The sun was higher now, warming the air. As he passed Sarah Miller's house, he saw her in her garden, pulling the last of her carrots. She wore a brown dress and a shawl, her hair tied back. Thomas slowed the cart, his heart beating a little faster. He wanted to say something, maybe ask about her garden, but his tongue felt heavy. Sarah looked up and saw him. She waved, a small smile on her face. "Morning, Thomas," she called, "and been to the mill?" Thomas nodded, stopping the cart. "Just got my corn ground," he said. "Samuel did a good job." "That's nice," Sarah said, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm about done with my garden, just these carrots left." "They look good," Thomas said, glancing at the neat rows. He searched for something else to say. "You, going to church tomorrow?" "I am," Sarah said. "Mary and I never miss it." Thomas nodded, feeling a little braver. "Maybe I'll see you there," he said. Sarah's smile grew. "Maybe you will." She went back to her carrots, and Thomas flicked the reins, starting the cart again. It wasn't much of a talk, but it felt like progress. He thanked God silently for the moment, asking for more courage next time. Back home, Thomas stored the meal in his barn. He spent the afternoon chopping firewood, the steady thwack of his axe filling the quiet. He thought about the mill, Samuel's words about the winter, and Sarah's smile. His life was small, but it was full of small blessings. He prayed as he worked, asking God to keep the village safe through the cold months. At supper, Thomas ate cornbread made from the fresh meal, with a bit of butter he'd traded for with Martha Davis. He sat by his fire, the room warm and cozy. He read his Bible again, this time about the loaves and fishes, how Jesus fed so many with so little. Thomas liked that story. It reminded him that God could do big things with small gifts. Before bed, Thomas prayed, thanking God for the mill, the meal, and the chance to talk to Sarah. He asked for health for Hannah and strength for the village. He fell asleep to the sound of wind outside, trusting God's plan for another day. Winter's chill crept into the Massachusetts village, and Thomas Baker woke to frost on his window. The air in his small log house was cold, and his breath hung in clouds as he sat up in bed. He pulled his blanket tighter, then knelt on the wooden floor to pray. His knees pressed into the cold boards, but he didn't mind. Prayer warmed his heart. He thanked God for the new day, for the roof over his head, and for the harvest stored safely in his barn. He asked for strength to face the winter, and for warmth for his neighbors. Thomas lit a fire in his fireplace, the crackle of wood filling the quiet. He boiled water for tea, and ate a simple breakfast of cornbread and an apple. The cornbread was from the meal he'd gotten at Samuel Brown's mill, and it tasted good, even cold. As he ate, he looked out at his fields, now bare and dusted with frost. The world felt still, like it was waiting for spring. Thomas didn't mind the quiet. It gave him time to think about God and his place in the world. Today was a work day, but not in the fields. Thomas needed to check his firewood and mend a few tools before the snow came. He put on his heavy coat and boots, grabbed his axe, and stepped outside. The air stung his cheeks, and the ground crunched under his feet. He walked to his woodpile, counting the logs. There were enough for a few months, but he wanted to be sure. A hard winter could last, and he'd promised to share with Widow Hannah Green if she ran low. As he chopped more wood, Thomas thought about Hannah. She'd been sick, Samuel had said. Thomas decided he'd visit her later. maybe bring some potatoes or apples. It was what neighbors did, and he felt God wanted him to look out for others. He swung his axe, the rhythm steady, each swing sending chips of wood flying. The work warmed him, and he prayed as he chopped, asking God to heal Hannah and keep the village strong. By midday, Thomas's arms were tired, but the woodpile was bigger. He sat on a stump to rest, drinking water from his tin cup. The sky was grey, and a few snowflakes drifted down, melting as they touched the ground. Thomas watched them, thinking about how God made each one different. It was a small thing, but it reminded him of God's care for every detail of the world. After his break, Thomas went to his barn to mend his tools. His hoe had a loose handle, and his shovel's edge was dull. He sat on a stool, working carefully with a hammer and a sharpening stone. The barn smelled of hay and earth, a comforting smell. As he worked, he thought about church the next day. He'd see Sarah Miller there, sitting with her sister Mary. He remembered their talk by her garden, how she'd smiled when he mentioned church. He wanted to talk to her again, but he wasn't sure what to say. He prayed for guidance, asking God to help him find the right words. When the tools were fixed, Thomas loaded a small sack with potatoes and a few apples. He hitched Daisy to his cart and started toward Hannah's house, a mile away. The path was quiet, the village wrapped in the hush of early winter. Hannah's house was small, with a sagging roof and a thin trail of smoke from the chimney. Thomas knocked softly, not wanting to startle her. Hannah opened the door, her face pale but smiling. "Thomas, what a surprise," she said, her voice weak. "Come in, it's cold out there." Thomas stepped inside, the room warm from a small fire. "Brought you some potatoes and apples," he said, setting the sack on her table. "Heard you've been sick." "That's kind of you," Hannah said, sitting by the fire. "I'm feeling better, thanks to Pastor William's prayers and some rest. God's been good to me." Thomas nodded, glad to hear it. "I've been praying for you too," he said. They talked for a while about the weather and the harvest. Hannah told him how she'd been reading her Bible, finding comfort in the stories of God's care. Thomas listened, feeling the same comfort. He didn't stay long, not wanting to tire her. He promised to check on her again and left, the snow falling a bit heavier now. On the way home, Thomas passed Sarah's house. Her garden was covered in frost, the plants pulled for the season. He didn't see her, but he thought about her smile. He prayed again, asking God to show him if he should try to know her better. He didn't want to rush, but he felt something stirring in his heart. Back home, Thomas cooked a supper of potatoes and tea. He ate by the fire, the room cozy against the cold outside. He read his Bible, turning to the book of Job. The story was hard, but Thomas liked how Job trusted God through everything. It reminded him to keep faith even when life was tough. He wasn't Job with big trials, but he wanted to trust God in his small life. Before bed, Thomas prayed, kneeling by his bed. He thanked God for the firewood, for Hannah's health, and for the quiet day. He asked for wisdom about Sarah and strength for the winter. He climbed into bed, the fire's glow fading. The snow fell softly outside, and Thomas felt at peace. His life was plain, but it was good. God was with him, and that was enough. The Massachusetts village lay under a thin blanket of snow, and Thomas Baker woke to a world of quiet white. His small log house was cold, the fire from the night before reduced to ashes. He knelt by his bed, the floor icy under his knees, and prayed. He thanked God for the warmth of his blanket, the food in his barn, and the promise of church today. Sundays were a steady anchor in Thomas's life, a time to feel close to God and his neighbors. He asked for a safe walk to church and a heart open to the pastor's words. Thomas lit the fire, the crackle of kindling a familiar comfort. He boiled water for tea and ate a breakfast of cornbread with a smear of butter he'd traded for. As he ate, he looked out his window at the snow-dusted fields. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath. Thomas liked winter's quiet. It made his prayers feel louder, like God was listening a little closer. He put on his heavy coat, scarf and boots, then grabbed his Bible. The walk to church was slow, the path slippery with snow. Thomas stepped carefully, his breath puffing out in clouds. The village was hushed, with only a few trails of smoke rising from chimneys. He passed James Carter's house where James was shoveling snow from his doorstep. "Morning, Thomas," James called. "Careful on that path, it's slick." "Thanks, James," Thomas replied, waving. "See you at church?" "Wouldn't miss it," James said, grinning. Thomas kept walking, the church's leaning steeple coming into view. The building looked cozy, its windows glowing faintly against the grey sky. A few villagers were already there, stomping snow from their boots. Thomas nodded to Martha Davis, who was carrying a basket of bread for after the service. Inside, the church was warm, the air smelling of wax and wood. Thomas took his usual seat near the back, opening his Bible to pass the time. He saw Sarah Miller and her sister Mary walk in, their cheeks pink from the cold. Sarah wore a grey shawl over her blue dress, and Thomas felt his heart skip. He looked down at his Bible, pretending to read. He wanted to say something to her later, maybe about the snow, but the thought made his hands clammy. Pastor William Jones stepped to the front, his grey hair neat under his hat. He smiled at the small crowd and began with a prayer, asking God to warm their hearts and homes through the winter. Thomas bowed his head, feeling the words settle over him like a blanket. The sermon was about the birth of Jesus, how God sent his son to a simple stable. Pastor William's voice was calm, saying God chose humble places and people to show his love. Thomas nodded to himself. He was humble, just a farmer, but he hoped God could use him too. The congregation sang a hymn, their voices soft in the cold air. Thomas sang quietly, his deep voice blending with the others. The hymn was about God's light shining in dark times, and it made Thomas think of the snowy morning outside. He felt grateful for the church, for the warmth of faith that carried him through winter. After the sermon, Pastor William announced that widow Hannah Green was feeling better and might come to church next week. Thomas smiled, relieved. He'd prayed for her, and it seemed God had answered. The service ended with another prayer, and people stood to talk. Thomas stayed in his pew, watching as Sarah helped Mary set out bread and cider for the congregation to share. James Carter sat next to Thomas, his big frame filling the pew. "Good sermon today," James said. "Makes you think about how God works in small ways." "It does," Thomas said. "I like that. Small ways fit my life." James chuckled. "You're a good man, Thomas. Steady. God likes steady." He patted Thomas's shoulder and went to get some cider. Thomas stood, brushing his coat. He saw Sarah by the table, pouring cider into cups. His stomach twisted, but he felt a nudge to talk to her. He prayed silently for courage and walked over. "Morning, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice soft. "Nice service today." Sarah looked up, smiling. "Morning, Thomas. It was nice. I liked the part about the stable." She handed him a cup of cider. "Want some? It's warm." "Thanks," Thomas said, taking the cup. The cider was sweet and warmed his hands. "You, make it through the snow all right?" "We did," Sarah said. "Mary slipped once, but we managed." She laughed, and Thomas felt his nerves ease. "Your fields holding up in this cold?" "They're fine," Thomas said, "all stored away. Just keeping the fire going now." He paused, searching for words. "Your garden's done for the season, I guess?" Sarah nodded. "All pulled up. I'm saving some seeds for spring." They talked a bit more about the snow and the church. It was simple, but Thomas felt it was enough. He thanked her for the cider and stepped back, letting others get to the table. As he walked home, the snow crunched under his boots. He thought about the sermon, about God choosing simple places. He thought about Sarah's laugh and how it made him feel less alone. He prayed, thanking God for the church, for Hannah's health and for the small talk with Sarah. He asked for patience, trusting God's timing for whatever came next. At home, Thomas ate a quiet supper of potatoes and cider by the fire. He read his Bible, lingering on the Christmas story. He felt close to God, like the stable was right there in his little house. He prayed before bed, asking for warmth and faith through the winter. The snow fell outside and Thomas slept, content in his simple life. The Massachusetts village was deep in winter's grip, with snow piling high against Thomas Baker's log house. He woke to a faint grey light seeping through his frosted window. The air inside was cold, and he shivered as he knelt to pray. His morning prayers were simple, thanking God for warmth, food, and the quiet strength to face another day. He asked for protection from the cold and for his neighbors to stay safe. Winter was hard, but Thomas trusted God to see him through. He lit the fire, the wood crackling as it caught. Thomas boiled water for tea and ate a breakfast of cornbread and a boiled potato. The warmth of the food steadied him for the day's work. Today he needed to check his barn and make sure the snow hadn't damaged the roof. He also planned to visit James Carter to return a borrowed axe. Thomas liked to keep his promises, and he felt God smiled on small acts of honesty. Outside, the snow was deep, reaching his shins. Thomas pulled on his coat, scarf, and boots, wrapping himself tightly. He grabbed the axe and his Bible, tucking it under his arm in case he had time to read later. The path to the barn was buried, so he shoveled a narrow trail, his breath puffing out in clouds. The barn stood firm, but snow had piled against the door. Thomas cleared it, checking the roof for leaks. Everything held strong, and he thanked God for that. His stored corn and potatoes were safe, enough to last until spring. With the barn secure, Thomas set out for James's house a half-mile away. The snow made the walk slow, each step sinking deep. The village was quiet, the fields blanketed in white. Thomas passed Sarah Miller's house, its chimney puffing smoke. He wondered if she was warm enough, if her firewood was holding out. He thought about their talk at church, her soft smile over the cider. He prayed silently, asking God to keep her safe and maybe give him a chance to see her soon. James's house came into view, its windows glowing warmly. Thomas knocked, and Elizabeth Carter opened the door, her face brightening. "Thomas, come in from that cold," she said, stepping aside. The house was warm, smelling of bread and wood smoke. James sat by the fire, mending a leather strap. "Morning, Thomas," James said, standing. "Brought my axe back, I see." Thomas nodded, handing it over. "Thanks for letting me borrow it. Cut my firewood just fine." "Glad to hear it," James said. "Sit a spell. Elizabeth made bread." Thomas hesitated but sat, grateful for the warmth. Elizabeth brought him a slice of warm bread with butter. "You're too kind," Thomas said, taking a bite. The bread was soft and rich, a treat in the cold days. They talked about the winter, how the snow was heavier than last year. "Heard Samuel Brown's mill wheel froze up," James said. "He's working to fix it." "That's a shame," Thomas said, thinking of Samuel's steady hands. "I'll pray for him." "You're a praying man, Thomas," Elizabeth said, smiling. "That's a good thing. God listens." "I hope so," Thomas said, his voice quiet. He thought about his prayers, how they kept him grounded. He wasn't one for big gestures, but prayer felt like a conversation with God, steady and real. Before leaving, Thomas asked about widow Hannah. "She's doing better," Elizabeth said. "She was at church last week, looking stronger." "That's good news," Thomas said, relieved. He'd keep praying for her. He thanked James and Elizabeth, then stepped back into the snow. The cold hit him hard, but the bread in his stomach kept him warm. On the way home, he passed the church, its steeple barely visible through the falling snow. He thought about the sermon, about Jesus in the stable. It made him feel close to God, knowing he cared for simple folks like him. Back home, Thomas added wood to his fire and ate a lunch of potatoes and tea. He sat by the window, watching the snow fall. It was peaceful, but he felt a small stir of loneliness. He thought about Sarah again, wondering if she ever felt the same. He prayed, asking God to guide his heart and show him what to do. He didn't want to push, but he felt something growing, like a seed in spring. In the afternoon, Thomas read his Bible, turning to the book of Matthew. He read about Jesus walking on water, how Peter stepped out in faith but faltered. Thomas understood Peter's fear. He felt it when he thought about talking to Sarah, about stepping beyond his quiet life. But he also saw how Jesus lifted Peter up. Thomas wanted that kind of faith, to trust God even when he was scared. As evening fell, Thomas cooked a simple supper of cornbread and beans. He ate by the fire, the room glowing softly. The snow kept falling, muffling the world outside. He thought about his day, the barn, James's warm house, the bread. He thought about Sarah, her garden buried under snow. He wondered if she'd be at the next village supper, if he'd find the courage to say more than a few words. Before bed, Thomas prayed, kneeling by his bed. He thanked God for the barn's strength, for James and Elizabeth's kindness, and for Hannah's recovery. He asked for warmth through the winter and wisdom for his feelings about Sarah. He didn't know what God's plan was, but he trusted it would unfold, slow and steady like the snow. Thomas blew out his candle and lay down. The fire's glow faded, and the house was quiet. He listened to the soft patter of snow against the window, feeling God's presence in the stillness. His life was plain, full of small tasks and quiet prayers, but it was enough. He slept, warm under his blanket, ready for another day. The winter deepened in the Massachusetts village, and Thomas Baker's small log house creaked under the weight of fresh snow. He woke to a dim, cold morning, the air sharp as he knelt to pray. His breath clouded as he thanked God for his warm bed, the food in his pantry, and the strength to face another day. He asked for protection from the bitter cold and for his neighbors to have enough to get through the season. Prayer was his morning anchor, a steady start to his simple life. Thomas lit the fireplace, the wood snapping as it caught. He warmed his hands, then made tea and ate a breakfast of cornbread and a boiled apple. The sweetness of the apple reminded him of summer, and he felt grateful for his harvest. Outside, the snow was thick, covering his fields in a soft white blanket. He had no crops to tend now, but there were always chores, checking fences, cleaning tools, and making sure his horse, Daisy, was comfortable in the barn. Today, Thomas decided to visit widow Hannah Green again. He'd heard she was feeling better, but winter was hard on older folks, and he wanted to be sure she had enough firewood. He filled a sack with a few potatoes and some cornbread, then bundled up in his coat and scarf. The path to Hannah's house was snow-packed, and Thomas walked carefully, the sack slung over his shoulder. The village was quiet, with only the crunch of his boots breaking the silence. As he passed Sarah Miller's house, he saw her outside, shoveling a path to her door. She wore a heavy shawl and mittens, her cheeks red from the cold. Thomas's heart lifted, but he hesitated. He wanted to say something, maybe offer to help, but his shyness held him back. He raised a hand in a small wave, and Sarah waved back, smiling. "Morning, Thomas," she called. "Cold one today." "Morning, Sarah," Thomas replied, his voice soft. "You managing all right?" "Just keeping the path clear," she said, leaning on her shovel. "You headed somewhere?" "To Hannah's," Thomas said, lifting the sack, bringing her some food. "That's kind," Sarah said. "She'll appreciate it." She went back to shoveling, and Thomas kept walking, his heart a little warmer. He prayed silently, thanking God for the chance to see her, and asking for courage to say more next time. Hannah's house was small and weathered, but smoke rose from the chimney, a good sign. Thomas knocked, and Hannah opened the door, her face brighter than last time. "Thomas, you're a blessing," she said, stepping aside. "Come in, warm yourself." The room was cozy, with a fire burning low. Thomas set the sack on her table. "Brought some potatoes and cornbread," he said. "How you holding up?" "Better every day," Hannah said, sitting by the fire. "God's been good, and the village too. Pastor William stopped by yesterday with some broth." She gestured to a chair, and Thomas sat, his hands resting on his knees. They talked about the winter, how the snow kept coming. Hannah shared a story about her late husband, John, who'd loved winter for its quiet. "He'd say God made snow to hush the world so we could hear him better," she said, smiling. Thomas nodded, liking the thought. He felt God in the quiet, too, in the stillness of his fields and the calm of his prayers. Hannah asked about Thomas's farm, and he told her about his stored crops and firewood. "Got enough for now," he said. "Happy to share if you need anything." Hannah thanked him, her eyes kind. Thomas felt good, knowing he was helping. He believed God wanted neighbors to look out for each other, especially in hard times. When he left, the snow was falling lightly, dusting his coat. The walk home was cold, but Thomas felt warmed by Hannah's gratitude. He thought about her words, about God hushing the world. It made him want to pray more, to listen for God's voice in the winter's quiet. He passed Sarah's house again, but she was inside now, her path cleared. He wished he'd offered to help. Maybe next time, he thought, praying for boldness. At home, Thomas ate a lunch of beans and cornbread by the fire. He read his Bible, turning to the book of Psalms again. The verses spoke of God's care, like a shepherd watching over his flock. Thomas felt like one of those sheep, guided by God through the cold days. He wasn't rich or important, but he felt cared for, and that was enough. In the afternoon, Thomas cleaned his tools, oiling the handles to keep them from cracking in the cold. He worked in the barn, where Daisy munched hay in her stall. The work was simple, but it kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He thought about Sarah, her shovel in the snow, and wondered if she ever thought of him. He prayed again, asking God to show him if his feelings were part of his plan. As evening fell, Thomas cooked a supper of potatoes and tea. He sat by the fire, the room glowing softly. The snow outside was steady now, piling higher. He read more of his Bible, lingering on a verse about God's faithfulness. It comforted him, knowing God was there, even in the long winter nights. Before bed, Thomas prayed, kneeling by his bed. He thanked God for Hannah's health, for the food he'd shared, and for Sarah's smile. He asked for strength to keep helping others and wisdom for his heart. He blew out his candle and lay down, the fire's warmth lingering. The snow fell quietly and Thomas slept, trusting God's steady hand over his simple life. The Massachusetts village was locked in winter's hold, with snow blanketing the ground and a sharp chill in the air. Thomas Baker woke in his small log house, the room cold despite the embers glowing in the fireplace. He knelt by his bed, his breath visible as he prayed. He thanked God for the warmth of his blankets, the food in his stores, and the quiet days that let him think about faith. He asked for strength to face the cold, and for his neighbors to have enough to keep them warm. Thomas stirred the embers and added wood, the fire flaring to life. He made tea and ate a breakfast of cornbread and a boiled potato, the simple meal filling him with gratitude. Outside, the snow was deep, and the sky was a heavy grey. Today, Thomas planned to deliver some firewood to widow Hannah Green. He'd heard from Elizabeth Carter that Hannah's supply was running low, and he wanted to help before the next storm came. Helping neighbors felt like God's work, small but important. He bundled up in his coat, scarf and gloves, then went to the barn to load his cart. The air stung his face, but he worked quickly, stacking logs carefully. Daisy, his horse, snorted softly as he hitched her to the cart. Thomas patted her, thanking God for her strength. He added a small sack of apples to the cart, thinking Hannah might like them. The path to her house was snow-packed, and Thomas guided Daisy slowly, the cart's wheels crunching through the drifts. The village was quiet, with smoke curling from chimneys. Thomas passed Sarah Miller's house, its windows frosted over. He didn't see her, but he thought about their last talk, how she'd smiled when he mentioned Hannah. He wanted to do something kind for her too, maybe bring her some firewood later. His heart beat faster at the thought, and he prayed for courage to act on it. He didn't know if Sarah felt anything for him, but he trusted God to guide him. Hannah's house appeared through the snow, its roof heavy with white. Thomas knocked and Hannah opened the door, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. "Thomas, you're out in this cold," she said, her voice warm despite her frail look. "Come in." "I brought firewood," Thomas said, gesturing to the cart. "And some apples. Thought you might need them." Hannah's eyes softened. "You're too good, Thomas. God bless you." She invited him inside, but Thomas said he'd stack the wood first. He worked steadily, piling the logs near her door where they'd stay dry. The effort warmed him, and he felt good knowing Hannah would be comfortable. When he finished, he stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. The room was small but cozy, with a fire burning low. Hannah offered him tea, and Thomas sat grateful for the warmth. They talked about the winter, how the snow seemed endless this year. "I've been reading my Bible more," Hannah said. "Keeps me company. The story of Daniel in the lion's den, it's a comfort." Thomas nodded. "I like that one too. Shows God protects us, even in dark times." He thought about his own life, how God's presence felt steady, like the fire in his hearth. He wasn't facing lions, but winter's challenges were enough to test his faith. Hannah asked about his farm, and Thomas told her about his stored crops and Daisy's health. "I'm set for the season," he said. "Happy to help if you need more wood." Hannah thanked him, saying his visit brightened her day. Thomas felt a quiet joy, knowing he'd done something good. He believed God worked through small acts, like carrying firewood through the snow. As he left, the sky was darkening and the air grew colder. Thomas guided Daisy home, the cart lighter now. He passed Sarah's house again and saw her at the window looking out. He waved, and she waved back, her face barely visible through the frost. Thomas's heart lifted, but he didn't stop. He prayed, asking God to show him if he should reach out to her, maybe offer some firewood. The thought made him nervous, but he wanted to try. At home, Thomas unhitched Daisy and gave her extra hay. He ate a lunch of beans and cornbread by the fire, the room warming slowly. He thought about Hannah's words, about Daniel and God's protection. It made him feel safe, knowing God was watching over the village. He read his Bible, turning to the book of John, where Jesus spoke about being the good shepherd. Thomas liked that image, God guiding him like a shepherd, even through the snow. In the afternoon, Thomas checked his own firewood, counting the logs to be sure he had enough. He decided to set aside some for Sarah, just in case she needed it. The thought of knocking on her door made his stomach twist, but he felt it was the right thing. He prayed again, asking for boldness and clarity. He didn't want to push, but he wanted to show he cared. As evening fell, Thomas cooked a supper of potatoes and tea. He sat by the fire, the snow falling steadily outside. He read more of his Bible, lingering on the verses about the shepherd. They comforted him, reminding him that God was near, even in the quiet winter nights. He thought about Sarah, Hannah, and the village, all bound together by small kindnesses. Before bed, Thomas prayed, kneeling by his bed. He thanked God for the chance to help Hannah, for Daisy's strength and for Sarah's wave. He asked for wisdom to know his heart and courage to act on it. He blew out his candle and lay down, the fire's glow fading. The snow muffled the world, and Thomas slept, trusting God's quiet guidance in his simple life. The Massachusetts village was buried in snow, and Thomas Baker woke to a world of icy stillness. His small log house creaked as the wind pushed against it, and the air inside was sharp with cold. He knelt by his bed, his hands clasped, and prayed. He thanked God for the warmth of his fire, the food in his barn, and the quiet days that let him feel close to his faith. He asked for strength to face the winter, and for his neighbors to have enough to stay warm and fed. Thomas stoked the fire, adding logs until the room glowed with heat. He boiled water for tea and ate a breakfast of cornbread and a boiled apple, the simple meal grounding him for the day. Outside, the snow was deep, covering his fields and the path to the village. Today, Thomas planned to check on his fences, which sometimes sagged under the weight of snow. He also wanted to bring some firewood to Sarah Miller. He'd been thinking about her since their last wave, and he felt God nudging him to do something kind. He bundled up in his coat, scarf, and gloves, then went to the barn to load his cart with firewood. Daisy, his horse, snorted as he hitched her up, her breath steaming in the cold. Thomas added a small sack of potatoes to the cart, thinking Sarah might appreciate them. The path to her house was slick, and he walked slowly, guiding Daisy through the drifts. The village was hushed, with only a few footprints breaking the snow. As he neared Sarah's house, Thomas's heart beat faster. He saw smoke rising from her chimney, a good sign she was warm, but he wanted to be sure. He stopped the cart by her gate and took a deep breath, praying for courage. He knocked on her door, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. Sarah opened it, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, her face surprised but warm. "Morning, Thomas," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "What brings you out in this snow?" "Morning, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice soft. "Brought some firewood and potatoes, thought you might need them." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's so kind, Thomas. Come in, it's freezing out there." Thomas hesitated, then stepped inside, brushing snow from his boots. The room was small and tidy, with a fire burning steadily. Sarah took the sack of potatoes and set it on her table. "I'll stack the wood," Thomas said. "Don't want you out in the cold." "You don't have to," Sarah said, but Thomas insisted. He went outside and piled the logs near her door where they'd stay dry. The work warmed him, and he felt good knowing Sarah would have enough firewood for a while. When he finished, he stepped back inside, his hands red from the cold. Sarah offered him tea and Thomas sat by the fire, grateful for the warmth. "This is real nice of you," Sarah said, pouring tea into a tin cup. "Winter's been hard, but folks like you make it easier." Thomas nodded, his face warm from more than the fire. "Just trying to help," he said. "God wants us to look out for each other." "He does," Sarah said, smiling. "I've been reading my Bible more lately. Helps me feel less alone in this snow." Thomas sipped his tea, comforted by her words. "What have you been reading?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "The Psalms," Sarah said. "They're peaceful, like God's talking right to you." "I like those too," Thomas said. "They make me feel like God's watching over us no matter how cold it gets." They talked a bit more about the winter and the church. It was simple, but Thomas felt a connection, like a small spark in the cold. He didn't push, but he was glad to be there. When he left, Sarah thanked him again, her smile lingering in his mind. Thomas guided Daisy home, the snow falling lightly now. He thought about their talk, how easy it felt once he started. He prayed, thanking God for the chance to help and for the courage to knock on her door. He asked for wisdom to know what came next. Back home, Thomas ate a lunch of beans and cornbread by the fire. He checked his fences in the afternoon, clearing snow from the posts to keep them sturdy. The work was slow, but it kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He thought about Sarah's words, about the Psalms and God's presence. He felt the same, like God was near in the quiet winter days. As evening fell, Thomas cooked a supper of potatoes and tea. He sat by the fire, the room cozy against the cold outside. He read his Bible, turning to the book of Luke, where Jesus taught about loving your neighbor. Thomas thought about the firewood, how it was a small way to show care. He hoped Sarah felt that care even just a little. Before bed, Thomas prayed, kneeling by his bed. He thanked God for the chance to help Sarah, for their talk, and for the warmth of his home. He asked for strength to keep doing good and for clarity about his feelings for Sarah. He didn't know if she saw him the way he saw her, but he trusted God to guide him, step by step. Thomas blew out his candle and lay down, the fire's glow fading. The snow fell softly outside, muffling the world. He thought about Sarah's smile, Hannah's recovery, and the village holding together through the cold. His life was plain, full of small tasks and quiet prayers, but it was good. He slept, trusting God's plan was unfolding, slow and steady like the winter snow.